Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Marquit and this is the first video of the Alpha Texture Tutorial series. In this particular video I want to start out with a simple grass plane, kind of understanding how to create them. I have Google open here with some images. I just typed in grass planes in Google image search, and you can see right here some examples. This is just a plane, right, with a texture on it. In this case, they actually rotate the texture a bunch to create kind of like this little patch. But in some cases, it could almost legitimately be a plane and just one plane. And just like Unity, what Unity does is these what is known as camera-facing planes. You actually, this one right here, these are actually just planes. It looks like maybe they might be bent in one spot only to add just a little bit of depth, but they just kind of lay them around in different angles to create more grass. You see, there's all different styles of creating grass. But what we're going to do is we're just going to do a super simple grass plane like this one you can actually see here, where it's cross hatching, so it's like just making a little plus sign out of the two. So let's take a look real quick. So we're going to jump into Photoshop. We're actually going to create a new image. Right, so we're going to do a 256 by 256 pixel. So I'm going to type in 256 here by 256. We're going to make sure we're at 72 dpi and so on. Pixels, of course, and not inches. We're going to hit create. So this is going to be a little bit smaller document than what we're kind of used to and some of the other stuff that I've been showing, because it doesn't need to be big. It's just a small image. Now you could make a full 1024 by 1024 image and have a whole bunch of different planes on it that you can use to mix things up, but we're just going to do one real simple one. Now, first things first is I want to have kind of a background that isn't just as bright white. Now, what we'll typically do is I'll pick a color that I kind of want my green to be for my grass, and we'll say something to this effect, and I'll just kind of fill that in with the paint bucket here. So we can just grab paint bucket. Now we have a background. Now what ends up happening with alpha textures, they tend to get a little bit of a halo, so you usually want to use a color that is close to the color of the texture you're going to actually be painting. So if you do get a little bit of a halo, a little texture bleed, as it's also called, then it won't look too bad. So I just made the background this green. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to choose another green. In this case, you want to usually pick two different colors of green that you want your grass to be. You can pick like a lighter and a darker one. This one might be considered the darker one, so I'll pick just a little bit of a lighter one. It could be even more yellowish, right? Just a tinge yellowish. You can see the difference between these two colors. Okay, and this is going to matter in a second, but I just want you guys to know that I'm choosing these two colors for a reason, and what that real reason is, I'm actually going to add a new layer here, and I'm going to hide this background layer for the moment so that we can see what we're actually doing. Now, I'm going to grab the paint tool, and if you click on right here and choose your paintbrush, there's a bunch of different options. The cool thing is Photoshop actually has a grass brush option. Now, I'm going to increase the size of the brush so we can see it. Okay, and I can click on there and kind of see that's just a little bit too big. So let's shrink that brush down. Just kind of pops right there. There we go. Something closer to this might be good, right, as far as the image is concerned. Now you'll notice if you actually start painting, and remember, you want to be in a brand new layer. We're not painting on the background, separate layer. If you start painting, you'll see kind of what's happening here, right? So it's taking this brush, it's randomly rotating it and changing between the colors. And what it does is it takes any value in between the transition of these two colors and just randomly throws it in there. So if you think you're getting a little too much value, you can stop. But basically, this is it. Like, I just created a texture for grass. Now, the idea here is that you don't want your texture to kind of go off the edge. So if I start painting like this and you're getting your grass cut on the edge, it looks bad, right? We don't want that. We want the grass to stay in the middle and, of course, not go too high either. We don't want it to get cut off at the top either. It's going to look odd if the grass gets cut off. So this is actually pretty good where I've centered it, and you see the kind of grass coming off in different sides. Now, of course, there's other brushes you can use. If you found brushes on the internet, you can even paint your grass if you want to, if it's very stylized. I'm just showing you guys this because it's actually really quick and looks fairly decent without any real effort. The other thing, as I said before, the brush itself has all these cool settings. If you actually hit F5, which is the hotkey to bring up the brush settings, which, by the way, if you just go to Window and click on Brush, you can find it here too. This will show you all those cool settings that, whoops, and I'll hit F5 again, that this particular brush has automatically. And the settings include shape dynamics, as in it lets it kind of change in size randomly just a little bit. The scattering kind of makes it move kind of back and forth. You'll see if I increase or decrease the scattering, right? That's kind of what happens there. Shape dynamics, same thing. If I change the jitter, which is the kind of the randomness of it, if I change the randomness in size, you'll get everything the same size, right? And you'll see how it changes and affects the brush down here. So that's the cool thing, is it's doing all of that stuff. It also has an angle jitter about 10%, so it'll kind of rotate on different angles right? If you have it set to 0, everything's the same. If you have it too much, well, if you have it 100%, it might even be upside down. That would look a little odd. That's why they only have it about 10%. And then they have a little bit of a roundness jitter. What that does too is that kind of deforms the shape just a little bit, and so on. But once again, anytime you see the word jitter, that basically just means randomness. So you can play around with these settings. Color dynamics is what it's set to right now with the foreground background jitter, so it just randomly chooses the two different colors between your foreground and your background. That one is set to 100%. It even has just a slight hue jitter to kind of add a couple more colors to the mix. And so on. So I'm not going to talk about the rest of them, but that just gives you kind of an idea of what you can do with a brush. Now these brushes automatically have this, so let's just say you find another brush on the internet that you really like of grass or some sort of vegetation and you want it to be random just like this one, you're going to have to open up the brush settings and change all of that stuff to match it, because it might not by default have any of those settings. So just keep that in mind as you use your brushes. So this is pretty cool, right? We got the thing going on, but what we need to do is actually create an alpha texture out of it. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is I'm going to hold down Control on the keyboard and I'm going to select the thumbnail of the image. What that does is it makes a selection out of anything that's painted. So you can see right now that I've now created a selection out of this. We're going to go to Channels. I'm going to lift this up a little bit here, and we're going to just make a brand new layer in Channels. So we'll just click on the new layer button, and it should be called just Alpha 1. Now you can call it whatever you want, but as long as you just have one in there, it's fine. You can make as many alphas as you want. It doesn't necessarily make too much sense for what we're going to do. Alphas could be used to save selections, you know, for Photoshop. But in the case of our game, we only want one, so we're going to have this one. So you have your RGB, your red, your green, and your blue, but then you have the alpha. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my color to white here, and you see, by the way, it automatically changes the colors to black and white because alphas only deal in shades of gray or black and white. Take the paint bucket here and we'll just paint in white, right? So here is our thing. Now we might getting a little bit of, you know, clipping right here. If we wanted to, we can kind of go back, and maybe I'll just do that real fast just to have it a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to hit Control D to deselect. Let's turn our RGB back on and shut off the alpha for a moment. We come back to this layer. I can just grab the eraser tool. Okay, so we'll come over here and grab the eraser tool and make sure I'm on the correct layer. There we go. And just kind of delete the ends of these so they don't all end at the same time. That's kind of what we're trying to avoid. So I'm just going to make sure that nothing kind of goes to the very, very edge. We'll delete that. And the same thing on this side. So I'll delete these and we'll maybe make them feel a little bit more random and so on. It's kind of hard to see that I'm deleting them, but I'm just erasing them on the side. Now if I hit Control and select the thumbnail, you should see the selection now never doesn't go anywhere on the edges. So we can go back to Channels, click on our alpha, fill that alpha in with white, and there you go. So that'll look a little bit better. Probably could clean up that little dot there and so on. I'll just hit Control D. I mean, you can change it just in here. I don't necessarily need to go back to my RGB. So if I wanted to switch this to black, grab a brush, change it to just a normal brush instead of this crazy kind of grass brush, shrink it down, and then paint out any of these little dots or anything like that just to clean it up. Maybe sharpen the edges on those. Looks like I missed a little spot right there or whatever, right? Same thing over here. We can sharpen those little edges, just make it look a little bit nicer, and so on. Same thing, maybe take that off because that looks a little odd. Something to that effect, all right? So you get the idea. Now, as I said before, you could basically just save it from here, but what we'll do is, actually, never mind, actually what we should do is turn the alpha, or not the alpha, but the background on like this before we save, so the background layer is also being saved. Now you can see the background's close to the color of this. It doesn't match everything, but you're not going to get one that necessarily matches everything. But as I said before, just to avoid the haloing or texture bleeding, just make your background color somewhat close to what is happening within the scene here. Okay, so now we're done with the texture. All we have to do is save it. So we'll go File, Save As. We just call this grass. So we'll just type in grass and we'll do _alpha. So you tend to want to call your textures, and I have to learn to spell here, alpha. You tend to want to call your textures whatever they are. So we'll get to more advanced textures later. But if it's like a normal map, then you'll do _normal. If it's a bump map, _bump. You know, if it's ambient occlusion, _AO, whatever, right? So on and so forth. So I'm just going to do grass _alpha so we know what it is. I'm actually going to switch this to be a Targa. So this is the file format we're going to be using. And then I'm going to hit save, or a TGA. So we'll hit save. It's going to have this little dialog box. If your texture, if you're saving textures out as Targas, you can leave them usually at 24-bit unless it has an alpha channel, which this one does. And we're going to make sure that it's 32-bit. So remember, 24-bit for normal textures, 32-bit, of course, for your alpha texture. We're going to hit OK. We're going to save this. Now I save this to my desktop. Now let's see how that works in Max. So now that we have N there, I'm going to maximize the screen with Alt-W. and we're going to grab a plane. So we're going to come over here and we're going to do a basic plane. So just draw this plane out, okay, something like kind of like a square. I'm also then going to rotate it up. All right, so we'll rotate it to, say, 90 degrees. So I can come down here and just type in 90 so we know it's straight up and down. Now I'm going to hit G to get rid of the whoops, click there, and hit G to get rid of the grid. So we can see this a little bit better. Now I'm going to hit M to open up my material editor. We're going to create a material. So we'll pull in a standard material here. I'm going to pull in a bitmap this time. So we're going to assign our bitmap. All right, so there it is. It's going to ask me where I want it. We'll go to desktop. I'll pick the grass alpha. We'll hit open. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign that to the diffuse. Okay, and we'll make sure that we'll have this set to show in viewport. We will assign this to the plane. Now by default, of course, you see that it's not working, right? The alpha is not being transparent. So we don't necessarily have a transparent texture yet. So there has to be more to it than just doing that. Now the cool thing about a plane, of course, we don't really have to unwrap it. If you just want to scale this appropriately, so if it looks like it's smushed, you know, whatever needs to be wider, that kind of thing, you can do this and make it look a little bit wider, or even go even further than that if you want. I mean, it's grass, so it's okay to have a little bit of distortion. We just basically scale it, and that's like unwrapping it. So the plane just has itself unwrapped already. We don't have to worry about it. But as I said before, we need to now alpha it. Now, we've been using diffuse here, but if we want to take the same map and we want to assign this to also the opacity, this will control how you can see it. Now, it does now be, it's see-through, but it doesn't look quite right. That's because the default settings aren't what we want. If we double-click here on the bitmap itself, you're going to see a section down here that says mono channel output. By default set to RGB intensity, so it basically just looks like the gray value of the RGB. In this case, it's not what we want. What we want is the alpha. So click on alpha, and then bam, there you go. Now you have your texture show up the way that you want. Okay, so pretty simple. Once that's set, that's awesome. Now you can also double click, and this only works in Max, but just so that you can actually see your texture on the other side, so it's not just jet black. Click on two-sided up here when you're on the default of the material, and now your alpha textures will show on both sides. Remember, this is only a Max only thing. You bring it to a game engine, it doesn't default to that, so it will only be in the viewport. Okay, so basically all you do from here, if you're just making grass plane, is yes, if you're say using Unity, oh, and we can actually see this if I click off, you see we're getting a little bit at the top, very top line right there. You see there's like a little green line. That's a little bit of texture clamping or texture bleeding. So what we're going to want to do to fix that, it's actually pretty simple. I did say we were going to unwrap it, but in this case it makes sense to do that. We'll open up the unwrap editor, come in here, and all you really have to do is take that top plane and move it down. Now one thing I didn't do too, which I should have done, and let me do that real quick, is we don't want to waste polygons. So if I actually turn the polygons on, you'll see that the default has all these cuts. Remember, it's just a plane, it doesn't need any of these extra cuts, so we can legitimately make sure that our plane has no length or width segments. So we're saving, unless of course we want to bend it a little bit, you know, that's possible too. Sometimes people put like maybe one width segment and then just bend it a little bit. Maybe we'll do that, right? And so then you can convert it down to an editable poly from here. Then we can grab just these two vertices and then just move them slightly out. So there's just a little bit of bend in it, something to this effect. All right, something like that. Okay, but keep in mind that if you have a ton of grass, this just doubles your polygons now that we put a split. So it's really all dependent on how many grass planes you're going to put in your scene. So you can leave it one plane, or you can do it like what I just did here, right, and cut it out. I'll hit F3 so we can actually see the texture on it. Okay, so there is the object right now. But like I said, in order to fix it, actually I'll show you two options to fix it just so you guys are aware. We can click on the unwrap, open up in the editor. We'll try that again, and literally all you have to do is grab your verts up here at the top and just move them down just a hair, just so that it isn't lining up with the top. Because really what's happening while we're seeing that line is it's taking whatever is on the bottom of the texture here, so we can even have the texture show up. It's taking basically what we're seeing down here and just putting it up here. So you're just getting one little pixel of it. So now there should, if we were to look at it, whoops, and I'll hold that. So I'll collapse this down. So now if you look and I click off with F4, we don't have a little line up there anymore, right? So that kind of fixed it. Now, the other way to fix it in Max, which is kind of cool too, as long as you're using editable poly, you can actually come in here, and if I was to say grab just the vertices or the edges on the top or whatever, if you were to say just move them by default, you'll get this, right? The texture will mush and stretch with the movement of the geometry. However, there is a little section down here under the edit geometry, if you click on preserve UVs, now I can move this up and down. It'll actually keep the UVs the same. You'll even see it repeats the texture if I lift it up too high. So this case, all we would have to have done if we had that little line, say like this, when we see that little line there, we just grab it using the preserve UVs and just move it down until we don't see that line anymore. And that's it. So those are two different ways of basically fixing that texture clamping thing. Now you can either save out this as the grass plane and put them kind of all over the place because we have them slightly bent, or you can always do the plus sign concept behind them. Usually if you bend them, you're not necessarily going to do the plus one, but we can do it anyways. So I'm going to hold shift while I'm rotating and rotate it around 90 degrees or so, and then hit OK, and there you go. So now you have kind of this little grass tuft. Right, and you can stick a bunch of these in the scene or whatever. Now, as I was mentioning before, Unity, say something like program like Unity, they do what is known as camera-facing grass planes. So no matter what, when the player walks around, however they're viewing at it, you can see here, we can see the sides of it. The player would only ever see the front of the poly because it's always facing you, the player. So if you're to say to look down on it from above it looks a little odd because it's like the grass flattens itself against the ground or whatever. But there's different engines do different things. But here's the idea. So this is all I'm looking for you guys to do as far as your grass plane goes. You want to be a little creative, go ahead. But that's basically the idea of how that works. Well, there are two little objects there. So hopefully this video helped you guys out a little bit, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next one.